Tonight is week number 7. Again, let me remind us that in paradise, Adam lived in a world with 2 trees. Adam chose to live in a world with only one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which I have taken in this class, this seminar, to be our human rationalism. And when God came looking, he found Adam naked and in a garden. And we began asking our question and exploring exactly what kind of world did a naked Adam create. We're dealing with human culture and the consequences of living in a world with only that one tree, our rational humanism. Last week, let me just read one sentence from last week and we'll jump into this week. On page 152, about a paragraph down, the Chaldeans, that's the Mesopotamians, the Chaldeans were the and their science became their masters. Astronomy became astrology, so that the study of the planets and that science of the stars, they made the leap then that the stars controlled human lives, and we lost our free will to the determinism of astrology, determining if it was a good day to do X or a bad day to do Y. So, chapter 7, an excursus. That's a side trip, an excursion. We want to take an excursus to fill in a few missing pieces before we get back on the road and our target of that naked man in a garden. An excursus. Astronomy becomes astrology. Science becomes scientism. Now let me again say, as I did last week, we are not against science. The issue isn't science, it's what somebody outside of the laboratory does with science that changes astronomy to astrology, which is a social use of the mathematic of the sky. So I am not in any way discussing science itself. I'm only discussing what happens when somebody else takes science and begins to apply it into our cultural, social setting. I hope that is clear, and I will say it again and again, I think, just to make sure. The ancient scientists of Mesopotamia, who invented mathematics, algebra, astronomy, and whose astronomical diaries are the longest continuous record of astronomical observations covering over 600 years. By the 1st century AD, the Chaldeans had the reputation of having, in a degree quite beyond that of other peoples, elaborated astronomy and the casting of nativities, predicting when something was going to take place, whether you should or should not do something. They had set up a harmony between things on earth and things on high, between heavenly things, the sky, and earthly things. That is a harmony between the behavior of the stars and the behavior of people, and a harmony between the movement of the stars and the botanical, when to plant, when the flowers are going to bloom, behavior of the earth, because there seemed to be a harmony biologically with the flowers. There had to be a harmony biologically with human beings. According to a first century account, these ancient scientists, following as it were the laws of musical proportion, have exhibited the universe as a perfect concord or a symphony produced by a sympathetic affinity between all the parts. Everything fit together. Separated indeed spatially, but they were housemates in kinship. That which was happening in the stars was in relationship in the same house and in a kinship with what was happening on earth. In other words, in the ancient world there came to exist a symbiotic relationship between science and human behavior shaped by that science. In the ancient world, this symbiotic relationship, this being housemates in kinship, was quite visible and openly acknowledged as the terms astronomy and astrology suggest. In fact, on some occasions, they almost became interchangeable terms. Today, this symbiotic relationship of science and someone making a social application of it would be found in our terms science and scientism. We are not discussing science. We are going to be discussing scientism. When someone creates a behavioral relationship between scientific information and then human behavior. The acquiescence and acceptance of a people to live in the same house in which science dwells, that kinship, creates that mutual identity, that kinship of becoming scientism in our lives. It is seen in the term science and scientism. Science becomes our master when astronomy becomes astrology. Likewise, science, rational knowledge, becomes our master when science becomes scientism, when human reason becomes rationalism. Science becomes scientism when anyone accepts that science's understanding of reality is true, that reality is only the physical, knowable, rationally, empirically known universe. Acceptance and believing are the same. When one lives their life according to what they accept or believe to be true. I accept that, then it's going to shape my behavior. According to science, there is nothing else but the empirical, nothing else but the rational way of knowing. Science is involved with knowing the knowable, empirical, rational world. The issue is whether or not that's all there is. On a practical level, we believe science when we plant our garden according to the calendar. However, every farmer and gardener know from their own personal experience what the truth is of when to plant for their location. When one plants a garden in Waco, Texas, is radically different than when one plants a garden in Wichita, Kansas, or Lincoln, Nebraska, even though they are essentially on I-35 vertical in the heart of the United States. In other words, every farmer and every gardener know that scientific truth is relative to their location. The farmer and the gardener are the masters of the tool when they choose when to plant, knowing what's best for their location, rather than the calendar being their master and automatically saying, this is when you plant in the temperate zone of North America. I guarantee you, if you plant as early in Nebraska as you would in Texas, it'll freeze out in Nebraska. And if you waited as long in Texas to plant when you would in Nebraska, it'll already be so hot it'll kill the plant before it ever gets out of the ground. On a community level, the acceptance, belief in the truth of mathematical calculations of science are used to shape and control human behavior. We are all in the age now of algorithms. You click on clickbait on your computer or on your phone, and the next thing you know, you get 10 ads to whatever you just clicked on. Mathematical calculations are being used for advertising purpose, shaping our lives, interrupting and bombarding us with information targeted to who the mathematical calculations have predetermined to say, this is who we are. You answer just a couple of questions and they'll predict everything about us. One only needs to consider, we're going to look at some examples now, the application of Darwin's theories on human biology to the creation of the American eugenics movement and its fulfillment in the Nazi Holocaust for an extreme modern example. Again, I am not discussing Darwin's theory of evolution. I am going to discuss what happens when that biological scientific theory is hijacked by culture, and a culture takes it out of a scientific laboratory and does something else with it. Science becomes scientism in the modern 1956. British scientist Charles Darwin published The Origin of the Species in 1859. In this book, Darwin introduced his theory of evolution and the birth of evolutionary biological science began. In 1864, after reading Darwin, English philosopher Herbert Spencer published Principles of Biology, in which he made Darwin's biological principle of natural selection under the average person by inventing and creating the phrase survival of the fittest. You see, Darwin said one thing, now we've got Spencer making an application of it. Watching when science becomes scientism, astronomy becomes astrology. Darwin's phrase was natural selection. The term natural was and is dispassionately neutral. it implied no value to the selection, nor did it imply a goal inherent in the selection. Darwin's natural selection was a neutral choice. Let me just quickly give an example. I am living on Kodiak Island in Alaska. Kodiak Island is famous for having a huge Kodiak bear population. I happened to encounter a bear one day, a mama bear with her cubs, and somehow I got between her and the cubs. I am in trouble, and I take off running, and the bear comes running after me, and I'm going to say, you, just include yourself, happen to be there with me. And together the two of us take off running to escape the bear. It just so happens you have fast feet. You contain the gene for swift running, and you take off like a bolt of lightning. I, unfortunately, I'm slow-footed. I don't run very well. And the result of the chase is the bear gets me. I'm now gobbled up, which means I did not live to have children and offspring to which I passed along the slow-footed gene. However, you, with your fast-footed feet, lived. You're going to be able to get married and have children, and your children will be born with fast-footed genes. And it would not take long before those of us with slow-feeded genes are no longer found on Kodiak Island. Now, we may be found somewhere else where we don't need to have fast feet. But those that have fast feet then that's natural selection. It's neutral. It's having that which was suited to survivability. But neutral doesn't just mean arbitrary. The choice was neutral, being simultaneous, simply the automatic selection of whatever was necessary between you and me to survive. You had it, I didn't. It's just, that's the selection. However, Spencer's changed the term to survival of the fittest, while being simple and easy to understand. By containing the term fittest, it now implied both value and a goal. Survivability was actually neutral. Fittest implied the best. It was the best which survived. It was the best suited for survival who survived. It was only the best that deserved to survive. Evolutionary biology, whatever one thinks about that is a different issue, had now been given a goal and a purpose by Spencer. Natural selection eliminated the weak and the unfit. See, those are values, while only the best and the fittest survived. The goal of evolutionary biology was became a progress of species as generation after generation eliminated the weakest with only the fittest surviving. Former English Prime Minister Arthur Balfour, almost 50 years after Spencer had coined the phrase, Balfour, speaking at the First International Congress of Eugenics in London, chided not their science, but their scientism, when he reminded them, we say that the fit survive, but all that means is those who survive are fit. Page 157. Darwinism becomes social Darwinism. Science is becoming astrology now. Spencer applied Darwin's biological science to society and created social Darwinism. Spencer applied the biological progress implied by evolution's survival of the fittest to the social areas of life, such as philosophy, sociology, religion, anthropology, psychology, political theory, economics, psychology, philosophy, literature, as well as astronomy. We now have the social sciences. Science becomes scientism. Astronomy becomes astrology. Biological theory became social theory. Biological Darwinism becomes social Darwinism. Since Darwinism was the survival of the best, I'm using Spencer's language now, based on the survivor being the fittest, Darwinism applied to social realities, including countries, races, and cultures, made it possible to document the progress from an inferior past to the fittest present, which progressively pointed towards a better, fitter tomorrow. Darwin's science became scientism as it evolved into social Darwinism. The second person actively advocating Darwinian scientism was Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. I know many of us haven't heard any of these names. Nicholas Gilham, the James B. Duke Professor of Biology Emeritus at Duke University, commenting on Galton's relationship with his cousin Charles Darwin, wrote, "The publication of Darwin's On the Origin of the Species in 1859 changed the direction of Galton's life. It so profoundly affected Galton that it made a marked epoch in my own mental development," he said, "as it did in human thought generally. The direction of his life having changed by Darwin's science, Galton, a polymath of renown in his own right, embarked on his quest to improve the human race." Galton published his book, Hereditary Genius, 10 years after Darwin's in 1869. Darwin effusively praised hereditary genius. He wrote to Galton, "I have only read 50 pages of your book," to the judge's part, "but I must exhale I gotta breathe, else something will go wrong with my inside. I do not think I have ever in all my life read anything more interesting and original, and how well and clearly you put every point. Science not only shapes culture by becoming scientism, but so shaped culture in turn now shapes science." 2 years later, in 1871, Charles Darwin being influenced by culture, is going to publish another book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, in which Darwin now applied his biological evolutionary theory to Spencer's social Darwinism in his discussion of nations, citing Spencer by name several times, even calling him our great philosopher Herbert Spencer. Biology is becoming social now. Darwin also made use of Galton's human biological theory. So you create science, someone hijacks it socially, it changes culture, and that shapes science. So Darwin initiated the biological theory, it gets hijacked, and now Darwin is writing another book making use of Galton and Spencer that hijacked him in the first place. Cross-fertilization, pollination happening. In The Descent of Man, Darwin's next book that I'm talking about, of course, that Darwin's thesis is that mankind did not descend as carbon copies of an original prototype, but have progressed biologically by natural selection, so that survival of the fittest is observable not only in the history of humans as persons, but in human civilizations as well. Darwin acknowledges that heretofore, quote, I have hitherto only considered the advancement of man from a semi-human condition to that of the modern savage. But some remarks on the action of natural selection on civilized nations may be worth adding. Admitting others have already discussed this topic, Darwin's additional remarks, identified as natural selection as affecting civilized nations, covers 13 pages in his book. Within those 13 pages, let me call our attention to Darwin's statements regarding the United States. Quote, there is apparently much truth in the belief progress of the United States, as well as the character of its people, are the results of natural selection. For the more energetic, restless, and courageous men from all parts of Europe have immigrated during the last 10 to 12 generations to that great country and have there succeeded best. Wow! None other than Charles Darwin just said the United States succeeded best. Wow! Upon writing this, immediately after the sentence, Darwin quotes a Reverend Mr. Zinke, whoever he was. He introduces the quotation with his endorsement that he believes Zinke is not exaggerating when he says that the events leading to the culture of Greece and to the empire of Rome, whatever cause, that would have been Mesopotamia, that led to the creation of Greece and Rome, are finally realized in the great stream of Anglo-Saxon immigration to the West, to the United States. Wow. 161, page. Social Darwinism in the United States. You see, we're talking about us now. We're not talking about the Chaldeans in Mesopotamia. Wow. We're living in a world where when you hijack science and make it scientism, something happens in culture. That's what we've been talking about for the 6 sessions leading to finally getting to us. Remember we studied Oedipus, and it wasn't just a story of Oedipus, but it was the people watching the play that had to figure out the riddle themselves. Maybe we're beginning to see that we're included in this story after all. 6 years after Darwin's Descent of Man, American scholar John Fiske developed corollaries from Darwin by stressing the superior character of Anglo-Saxon institutions and peoples. According to Fiske, the English race was destined to dominate the globe in the institutions, traditions, language, even in the blood of the world's peoples. That's Fiske. Following Fiske's lead, American clergyman Josiah Strong. You may never have heard of these guys, but Americans knew who they were and were reading their books. Following Fiske's lead, American Josiah Strong added now the sanction of religion to these theories of racial superiority. Strong argued that Anglo-Saxons embodied 2 great ideas: civil liberty, meaning democracy, and pure Christianity, which would have been Protestantism. He believed the Anglo-Saxon was divinely commissioned to be, in a peculiar sense, his brother's keeper. America, being declared best by Darwin, coupled with social Darwinism of Fiske and Strong, all merged in the United States to create an American exceptionalism, which it declared it was America's white man's burden to take care of the non-white world. By the end of the 19th century in the United States, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the WASP, had become the accepted identity for America. After the genocidal Philippine-American War, American sensibilities were divided over the acquisition of the Philippine Islands. President McKinley announced a U.S. policy by stating that the United States could not give the Philippine Islands back to Spain or give them to other rival countries. Instead, McKinley included, quote, "We could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule worse than Spain's was. So therefore, there was nothing left for us, America, to do but to take them all, the Philippine Islands, and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died." That is a speech given by the President of the United States, McKinley. Whether the Founding Fathers of our country were Christians or deists was now a moot question. Entering the 20th century, the United States was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation as a self-identity. American imperialism had been and created to spread democracy and Protestant Christianity to the rest of the non-white globe. We're just watching science become scientism in our own country. White American denominations created their various foreign mission boards and foreign mission associations to send white Americans out to take care of the lesser non-white populations of the world. Songs were written to stir the recruitment fever. There's a sound comes ringing o'er the restless waves. Send the light, send the light. There's souls to rescue, there's souls to save. Send the light, send the light. Send the light, the blessed gospel light. Let it shine from shore to shore, not just America's shore to shore, but from the shores of America to our shores. Let the light shine. Send the light, the blessed gospel light, and let it shine forevermore. And the American Protestant missionary movement was begun in the late 19th century. Wow. We're just looking at what happened when a biological theory got hijacked. Page 163. Meanwhile, social Darwinism on the home front. The Industrial Revolution brought millions of non-Western immigrants to the United States after the American Civil War. Millions. The very racially inferior people that the foreign missionaries were going overseas to Christianize and democratize had arrived here. Oops. With the arrogance of Anglo superiority dripping from every word, the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty became an open invitation to those unfortunate enough not to be white. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. You wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send the homeless, the tempest, send the worst you have. I lift up my lamp beside the golden door. Immigrants, the wretched refuse, had come by the millions. Woodrow Wilson, while president of Princeton University and not yet the president of the United States, said this while president of Princeton: the immigrant newcomers of recent years are men of the lowest class from the south of Italy and men of the meaner sort out of Hungary and Poland, men out of the ranks where there was neither skill nor energy nor initiative or any quick intelligence. You see, unlike Judaism and other religions, within itself, Christianity possessed no sacred law applicable to all aspects and departments of life. Orthodox Christianity has always taken Christ seriously when he said, "My kingdom is not of this world." One of the consequences of there not being an official social policy inside Christianity and inside the New Testament and the Gospels is then adding something else in to justify it. Most Protestants doing that to piggyback the Old Testament rules and regulations and trying to employ them in regulating culture. One of the consequences of this was that a whole sphere of social order lay outside the direct competence of the church, and hence was a secular world. And this secular sphere was a ready medium for the growth of a profane philosophical system. This scientism is about to get hijacked itself. Similar to Spencer's social Darwinism, Walter Rauschenbusch told Harvard Divinity School, Christianity must adapt to America's changing culture if it wanted to survive. Rauschenbusch, along with Josiah Strong and Charles Sheldon and others, adapting to the changing social culture being created by non-Western immigration, created America's social religion with progressivism as its secular side and the social gospel for its more religious side. Introduced the principle of religion having to adapt to culture in order to survive. That brings us to 164. Believe it or not, we're headed somewhere. Darwin plus Fiske and Strong. Darwin, you've got R-E-C in our genes. Restless, energetic, and courageous. Restless enough to not stay in the old country. Energetic enough to want to leave and having the courage to do it. He said those generations that had ERC showed up here. They had kids with women that had ERC. Bingo, the grandkids had ERC. And we got a nation that can't sit still. We're restless, we're energetic, and we're always looking for the next challenge because we've got the courage to do it. The only shortcoming we got is we like to do it quick. We don't like it to last 10 years to have a war. We're pretty good in 2 or 3 or 4. You add this, REC, to Fiske, white Anglo-Saxons, and you add Strong, then get WASP. And so you add that together, and we've now got scientism in the United States. We're getting there? Beginning to happen? Okay. Non-Western immigrants were from different cultures, different civilizations with different histories, language, and religions, and among that group was Orthodox Christians coming from Egypt, Palestine, Armenia, Greece, Serbia, etc., etc. I'm leaving somebody out, Ethiopia, Kenya, on and on and on. The Orthodox came among all of those people that Wilson said were unintelligent and not worth having in our country. Immigrants not only spoke a different language, but they also spoke a different culture. That is, they did not speak American. They did not think and behave like an American. American industrial cities were filled with noise, disease, and crime, all attributed to the inferior immigrant. Their presence was therefore a threat to American waspness. In addition to John Fiske and Josiah Strong, others also developed their programs from the biological theories and observations of Charles Darwin. Among them, Darwin's cousin, I've already mentioned him, Sir Francis Galton. In the same way, animal breeders sought to breed better stock, Galton invented eugenics that advocated improving the biological quality of the human race by having the best and fittest people mate. Charles Darwin had foreseen the possibility of applying natural selection to humans in his book, The Descent of Man. Drawing heavily upon the writings of Galton and others, Darwin discussed the natural selection among humans in terms of those who survive and those who do not. Since his observations are extremely pertinent in understanding eugenics, I shall quote him at length. With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit vigorous states of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute laws for the poor, and our medical men exert the utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. The weak propagate. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this policy of allowing the weak to propagate must be highly injurious to the race of mankind. It is surprising how soon a lack of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But except for man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. Darwin came to the realization that mankind, against all reason, not only permits but actively participates in helping its weaker members not only to survive, but by surviving to perpetuate their weakness by having children. Darwin then reflected on this human reality. The aid which we feel impelled to give to the helpless is mainly an incidental result of the instinct of sympathy, which was originally acquired as part of the social instinct and subsequently rendered in the manner previously indicated more tender and now widely diffused. Hard reason permits the weak not to survive in order for the healthy to survive and ensure the survivability of domesticated animals. When faced with the issue of applying such breeding practices used with domesticated animals to humans, that is, when faced with natural selection being applied to humans, Darwin stated, "Nor could we check our sympathy, even at the urging of hard reason, without deterioration of the noblest part of our nature." We can't do it, Darwin said. The surgeon may harden himself while performing an operation, for he knows that he is acting for the good of his patient. But if we were intentionally to neglect the weak and the helpless, it could only be for a contingent benefit with an overwhelming present evil. We must therefore bear the undoubtedly bad effects of the weak surviving and propagating their kind. Darwin, having invented the biology theory in the first place, now seeing where that theory was being taken into scientism, refused to go there. Survival of the fittest as a social policy for human society, Darwin rejected. Darwin tempers his willingness to let the weak live by discussing the social structure and policies that also tip the biological scale in favor of the stronger over the weaker. If this isn't making you a little sick at your stomach, maybe I wasn't clear. I can't believe people are talking about human lives this way. That's how naive I am. I know the air conditioner just cut off, so I'll get it on in just a minute. The weaker and inferior members of society, Darwin said, do not marry so freely as the sound and healthy. I don't know if that's ever been true or not. And this check might be indefinitely increased by the weak in body and mind, even refraining from marriage. I'm not sure refraining from marriage keeps them from having children anyway. Though this is more to be hoped than expected, and that wasn't a negative about the weak. That's just true of all sections of the economic human race. Darwin then continues into an enlarged discussion of the social and economic policies which mitigate the survival of the weak brought about by our human sympathy. Time permits the giving of only one example of Darwin's endorsement of social, economic, and political policies that favor the survival of the species by favoring the survival socially, economically, and politically of the rich. Darwin said, man accumulates property and bequeaths it to his children so that the children of the rich have an advantage over the poor in the race for success, independently of bodily or mental superiority. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, did not share Darwin's belief in human sympathy, nor did he believe the present social, economic, and political policies were sufficient to ensure the survival of the fittest among humans. Galton's eugenics opened the door for marriage laws, sterilization laws, immigration laws, and extermination laws of those deemed unfit. It is an interesting irony that Great Britain, the birthplace of eugenics, unlike some other countries, never passed any eugenic legislation related to the involuntary sterilization or immigration restriction. The only legislation related to eugenics that ever passed in the United Kingdom was the Mental Deficiency and Lunacy Act of 1913. It permitted segregation of those perceived to be mentally deficient, which eugenists regard as at least impeding, if not eliminating, propagation of the unfit. Elsewhere, Galton's legacy was much darker. Eugenic beliefs put into political practice turned many years of the 20th century into a nightmare. Well, this is dark enough as it is before we get to the nightmare. So let's take a break. Okay, if we're back, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, I'm grateful that you're still here after that dark first half that we just had. Science becomes scientism in the United States. In the United States, the driving force behind the eugenics movement was the fear within the Anglo-Saxons of the dilution of their whiteness biologically and the dilution of the whiteness of their culture by the inundation of foreign-born immigrants. Not only was America overwhelmed with millions of new immigrants, but the immigrants had a greater fecundity, which resulted in a higher birth rate than the old stock population. Page 169. The American eugenics agenda was to keep white America white. The positive side of eugenics encouraged the fittest to marry the fittest. In high schools all across the United States, they created fitter family clubs, where the high school students would take the pledge that I will marry only a fitter person and have fitter children, and they got the lapel pin to wear. The goal was for the fit white population to have more babies. The head cheerleader, of course, was therefore supposed to marry the quarterback. By 1914, courses on eugenics were offered at Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, Cornell, and Brown universities that sponsored eugenic research at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island. The National Education Association created a committee on racial well-being that taught college professors how to integrate eugenics into their courses. You have there in your book on page 169 a picture of one of the posters that would have been in our educational system. Only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. Within a decade, old stock America had been fully indoctrinated in Anglo-Saxon superiority. By 1928, over 20,000 college students, and in those days you didn't have a mass attendance of a society in higher education. Over 20,000 were enrolled in 376 separate college courses that advocated eugenics. Between 1914 and 1948, a majority of high school science texts discuss eugenics as a legitimate science, training high school students that immigration restriction, segregation, and sterilization were necessary tools for controlling the birth rates between the fit and the unfit. And now we come to the darker side on page 170. However, there was a more negative side, a darker side to eugenics. Positive eugenics sought to have the white population outbreed the non-whites. The negative sought to prevent unfit whites and immigrants from intermarrying with a fitter white population. The American eugenics movement promoted racial purity by 4 methods: laws requiring racial segregation, laws forbidding interracial marriage, sterilization laws for the punishment of the unfit, and immigration restriction laws. Having been indoctrinated with eugenic propaganda, American people easily then embraced eugenic ideology and eugenic policy. Soon became law in this land. For example, Virginia in 1924, followed by 15 other states, passed racial integrity laws that forbade the mixed racial marriages. One of the most famous in American history, going all the way to the Supreme Court, was Loving v. Virginia, where a white man had married a white woman in the state of Virginia. It's been made into a movie. Perhaps you have seen it. These laws restricting marriage remained in effect until, by unanimous decision of the United States Supreme Court in 1967, in our lifetime. The second method promoted by the eugenic movement for racial purity involved the involuntary sterilization of those deemed unfit to have children. In 1914, Harry Laughlin at the Eugenics Record Office drafted a document, the Model Eugenical Sterilization Law, that would legalize the sterilization of the socially inadequate. 12 states soon enacted sterilization laws. Tests were invented identifying defective humans who were then sterilized in order to prevent their having defective children. You think this is not about us? All of this was happening after World War I and before 1924, when our eugenics law closed our borders to all immigration. The Orthodox immigrants in Oklahoma were facing that kind of world. The Greeks settled in cities all across Oklahoma, and because they stuck out like a sore thumb, they got chased out of every town by the KKK, and the Greek population in the state of Oklahoma is still primarily located in Tulsa and Oklahoma City. The Middle Eastern population, being peddlers, found it much easier to blend in, and so we were scattered all over the state and almost opened dry goods stores and grocery stores in almost every little town and hamlet across the state as well. This is our history and the lives of our parents and grandparents that we're talking about. And by the way, there was a man by the name of Jack Skinner, convicted twice for robbery and once for stealing chickens in the state of Oklahoma, and therefore having 3 felonies, was subject to sterilization, and that was the penalty imposed upon Jack Skinner here in Oklahoma. It was appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, and in 1948 the Oklahoma sterilization law was finally declared unconstitutional. Of the thousands that were sterilized in the United States, the sterilization of Carrie Buck in Virginia is the most famous. The sterilization law enacted by Virginia was ultimately appealed to the United States Supreme Court. The case, known as Buck v. Bell, involved the involuntary sterilization of a 17-year-old girl, Carrie Buck, who had been raped and became pregnant. Her case was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, where Associate Justice, the very famous Oliver Wendell Holmes, himself a student of eugenics, wrote the formal opinion of the court in 1927. His decision includes the now infamous words, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Carrie Buck was involuntarily sterilized to keep her from having more unfit children. At the time, this had gone to the Supreme Court, and they authorized it. When she was sterilized, her daughter was old enough to be in her first grade report card indicated that she was a solid B student and had received an A in her deportment and had made the honor roll. Now let me tell you about St. Elijah's Carrie Buck's connection. Permit me to put a very human face on the horrors of eugenics and sterilization. Several years ago, I received a phone call from David Snyder, an adjunct professor of political science at a nearby university. He was interested in learning about the Orthodox faith. Several years later, after David had embraced the faith and had become a member of St. Elijah, David's mother, using her maiden name, Betsy Buck, moved to Oklahoma City from Virginia. She is in this room with us tonight. After learning about the Orthodox faith, she also embraced the faith and became a member of St. Elijah as well. I had never made the connection between Betsy Buck and Carrie Buck. Several years later, as part of a history project, I had sent out an email containing some comments about the eugenics movement in which I mentioned Carrie Buck. David Snyder, Betsy's son, saw the email and sent me the following email in reply, which I used by his permission. Carrie was a cousin to my great-grandparents on my mother. The superintendent of Carrie's hospital testified that the Bucks belonged to the shiftless, ignorant, and worthless class of antisocial whites of the South. In the court's decision, Oliver Wendell Holmes concluded that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. You will see that the problem wasn't social class or race. It was the local reputation of my ancestors alone that justified the use of eugenics. Tell your students that once you get to know us, we're really not bad folks. The following details are unnecessary but might be interesting. Carrie's cousin 3 times removed. She and her 2 siblings were all conceived by men other than the mother's husband. Frank Buck eventually divorced Carrie's mother, Emma. As a result, there is no direct blood lineage. We originally assumed a direct line based on oral history from family elders. Either they didn't know about Carrie's dysfunctional family, or they chose not to mention Emma's promiscuity and the resulting illegitimate children, which would have been a source of embarrassment for earlier generations. My brother and cousin have discovered these details through much genealogical work. Carrie's step-great-great-grandfather on Frank Buck's side, and my fifth great-grandfather, John Henry Buck, put the floors in Thomas Jefferson's Monticello and also built Jefferson's threshing machines. Shiftless, Carrie's stepfather, Fleming Buck, fought for the Confederacy and died as a result from wounds sustained at the Battle of Gaines' Mill in Virginia, outside of Richmond, known as the 7 Days Battle. The last known photo of Carrie is available online. After the sterilization was performed on Carrie, she was later paroled from the colony and married a man by the name of William Eagle, for whom she was married to for 25 years until his death. It became apparent in time that Carrie had a completely normal intelligence and was saddened by the fact she could not bear any more children. Carrie lived until 1983, where she died in a nursing home in Charlottesville. It was reported she died alone with no family. Ultimately, 60,000 Americans were involuntarily sterilized. Page 174, Beyond Sterilization. Those who actively supported eugenics included America's most progressive figures: Woodrow Wilson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Margaret Sanger, and many others. Margaret Sanger and others realized that the birth rate among educated white women would never match that of immigrant women. Therefore, she created Planned Parenthood as a means of getting immigrant women, as well as poor white trash, to kill their own babies. Sanger wrote, "The positive eugenist wants to shift the birth control emphasis from less children from the poor to more children for the rich." We went back of that and sought to first stop the multiplication of the unfit. There was no way rich white women were going to have more kids. This appeared the most important and greatest step towards race betterment. It is no accident that even today most Planned Parenthood clinics are located in the poorest and most ethnic parts of town, where the unfit willingly commit genocide by aborting their own children. In addition to laws legalizing racial segregation and sterilization laws also were passed forbidding the intermarriage of whites and non-whites. Finally, in 1924, the United States passed restrictive immigration laws, in effect closing its borders to all non-white immigration. This church was founded in 1920, when that immigrant group from southern Lebanon had arrived. They just made it before 1924, and they put down their roots in this kind of America and in the soil of Oklahoma, and thank God they did. Now, I have kept the worst for last. You're going, how could anything be worse? Page 175, the secret within the dirty little secret. So you won't find this in most of our textbooks. Any of it, we've just looked at it. It's there, but you can either lie about our history or you just omit it and pretend it never happened. Buried deep within the hidden by omission awareness of the American eugenics movement is the dirtiest little secret of all. It was the American eugenist who taught the Nazis how to do it. The success of the eugenics movement in the United States came to the attention of the Nazi government in Germany, which enacted their own sterilization law that eventually would lead to the sterilization of more than 350,000 people. Harry Laughlin, the superintendent of Cold Harbor, the eugenics research office on Long Island, proudly published a translation of the German law for the prevention of defective progeny. He was the leader of the eugenics movement. He was the director of the Office for Eugenics Research at Cold Harbor when it opened in 1910 until it closed in 1939. You see there a picture of Laughlin's honorary doctor's degree from Heidelberg University given to him for his eugenic work in 1936. The University of Heidelberg awarded Laughlin an honorary degree for his groundbreaking work in the science of racial cleansing. The Nazis used American eugenic principles without restraint and ultimately created the Reich's infamous genocide. During the pre-war years, American eugenists openly supported Germany's program. The Rockefeller Foundation financed the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and the work of its central racial scientists. Once World War II began, Nazi eugenics turned from mass sterilization and euthanasia to genocidal murder. One of Kaiser Wilhelm Institute's doctors in the program financed by the Rockefeller Foundation was Joseph Mengele, who continued his research in Auschwitz, making daily eugenic reports on twins. And page 177, United States Foreign Policy. It was only after the horrors of the Nazi eugenics became known, following World War II, that American eugenics sought to erase itself from public memory by quietly becoming invisible. But even though invisible, it remained very much alive in the foreign policy of the United States. Not only did the United States export eugenics to the Nazis, but the United States made eugenics part of its foreign policy under the guise of population control. The U.S. influenced program of forced sterilization in Puerto Rico, begun in the decades prior to World War II, ultimately led to over 1/3 of the female population of Puerto Rico being sterilized. In American eugenics after World War II, page 178, in 2010, the United States was forced to apologize to Guatemala once it was revealed that the United States had carried out syphilis experiments upon Guatemalans. The The United States had begun these experiments in 1948, 3 years after the Nazi atrocities had come to light. In 1974, Dr. Henry Kissinger wrote the National Security Administration NSA Memo 200, titled Implications of Worldwide Population Growth for the United States Security and Overseas Interests. In this memo, Kissinger proposed to the National Security Council, quote, depopulation should be the highest priority foreign policy towards the third world. The reality of racism, ethnic cleansing, forced sterilization, and sexual experiments faced by immigrants to the United States prior to World War II may have become publicly invisible in domestic policy following World War II, but that reality remained very much alive in the foreign policy of the United States into the 21st century. The Nazi Holocaust was the outgrowth of the American eugenics movement. One page 178, today in Germany, the American Nazi connection is not only becoming known in the United States, but in Germany as well. Stefan Kuhl, fellow at the Institute of Sociology at the University of Munich, represents contemporary German willingness to investigate its Nazi past. His fully documented The Nazi Connection, Eugenics, American Racism, and German National Socialism has been published by Oxford University Press. It provides a devastating indictment of the influence and aid provided by American scientists for the most comprehensive attempt to enforce racial purity in world history. This is embarrassing to talk about. I'm sorry. It's not just the Chaldeans turning astronomy into astrology. This is what we have done with science. When we created scientism, applied it to populations. Oh my God. 179, eugenics science became scientism. The eugenics movement was the socialization of biological science into biological scientism. It was American scientism parading as science that taught the Nazis how to achieve the Holocaust. If, as Darwin quoted, the cultural history of Greece and Rome had achieved its evolutionary goal and purpose in that great stream of Anglo-Saxon immigration to the West, that is, to the United States, if indeed the United States was the zenith of the civilized world, then it must be also acknowledged that the Holocaust, to which American eugenics gave birth, is likewise the horrific zenith of science becoming scientism. The American Nazi eugenic connection is the apex, the absolute apex of astronomy becoming astrology. It was not the first time, nor will it be the last time. It is what science becomes when science is no longer a tool, but a master. It is what happens when science becomes scientism. It is what happens when astronomy becomes astrology. It is what happens when human knowledge is restricted to one tree, rationalism. It is what happens when you build a community and a culture with Adam's one tree. This is what happens when the tool becomes the master. This is Mary Shelley's story of Victor Frankenstein's science in the 19th century, the Prometheus who took what belongs to the gods and gave it to mankind. Frankenstein was the name of the scientist, not the monster he created and could not control. This is the story of the Robert Oppenheimer taking Einstein's science where Einstein refused to go, and then balking at what was there, began to advocate the restriction of what he had created. The Chaldeans turned astronomy into astrology. We took biology and turned it into the Holocaust. We took physics and quantum physics and turned it into the atomic bomb. This is what happens when you only have one tree and it becomes our master. Wow. Well, God willing, and you return next week, we'll move on into the next chapter. We are slowly putting all the pieces in place to finally get to talk about what it's like to be naked living in a graveyard. Okay. Thank you very much. God bless you. Be safe going home.